want to talk about the latest updates that we have coming out of the Middle East. We've got Tony Blair in an article on Infowars.com from RT acknowledging that ISIS stemmed from the Iraq invasion, but he refuses to apologize for toppling Saddam. He says, I can say that I apologize for the fact that the intelligence we received was wrong. In other words, he's not apologizing. He's simply passing the buck. I want to take a look at what's going on with this Blair non-admission of problems. He says, I find it hard to apologize for removing Saddam. I think even from today in 2015, it's better that he's not there than that he is there. And I would have to say exactly how. When you stop and think about the massive amount of blood and money that has been spent, the massive amount of innocent lives that have been spent, the pollution of Fallujah with weapons of depleted uranium that is causing birth defects, things that are going to happen and continue to happen for generations. How do you justify something like that? And of course, when I look at Tony Blair confessing to what he says is blowback and then not even really taking responsibility for making the decision, look, those people work for you. As Harry Truman said, the buck stops with you. If you hire the intelligence people, if they're your people, they're producing the intelligence, you trust them, you don't want to vet that intelligence yourself personally, you're still responsible. You're ultimately responsible. You're the one pushing this war. And we know from just released memos that Tony Blair was conspiring with George W. Bush a year in advance of this all happening. This was something they were working on for a very long time. But of course, what he would like to do is he would like to have you continue to focus on the fact that mistakes are made, that this is all part of a blowback, that ISIS came from bad policy, that bad policy came from bad intelligence. That's simply not the case. Not the case at all. This is not blowback. This is criminal conspiracy to create ISIS. This is what we're looking at here. So there's this, when Errol Morris would do this with his documentaries, he would use this in Terratron. And they would be talking to a box instead of to a person. It would relax people, interestingly enough. That's how he got the murderer to confess. And it's how he got Robert McNamara, the former defense secretary during the Vietnam War. That's how he got him to confess to being a war criminal. Yeah, he did that. He got him to confess to using the Gulf of Tonkin as a false flag, interestingly enough. Now, that right there was huge. He got him to confess that they knew that the domino theory was total nonsense. He recalled a meeting that they had with the North Vietnamese decades after the war. And one of the North Vietnamese pounded the table and said, you stupid idiot. You thought we were going to become pawns of the Chinese? Don't you know anything about history? Don't you know that the Vietnamese have been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years for their independence? We didn't want to be slaves of the French. We didn't want to be slaves of the Americans. And we didn't want to be slaves of the Chinese either. And of course, we've seen that now in subsequent years. We've seen that there's been a back and forth of the Chinese trying to encroach upon Vietnam, and we've seen them pushing back. So he admitted that. He admitted that they knew that the Gulf of Tonkin, quote-unquote, attack was total nonsense, and they used it as justification to escalate the war. But he tried to deflect things. He didn't want to say that he was a war criminal because of Vietnam. What he wanted to say was, well, he was at the end of his life. He died shortly after this documentary was done. And so he wanted to confess to being a war criminal, but not in a way that could really get him in trouble. So what he said was the bombing campaigns that they had conducted during World War II against Japan, the firebombing campaigns, he said they caused massive destruction that was far worse than the nuclear weapons that were dropped. And he said it was unwarranted. And he said if we had lost the war, we would have been tried as war criminals. So he would confess to being over the top with World War II because World War II was recognized by everyone as being a just war. We were attacked by the Japanese, we responded. But when he would not confess to being a war criminal when it came to Vietnam because they had initiated that war. And they had created that war with a false flag attack. So watch that film. Watch Fog of War. It's a very well done documentary. It'll really enlighten you to it. But I thought about that again yesterday as I saw this Blair acknowledgement of ISIS being created by their blowback, by their bad policy. I was watching another documentary. It was a screening by a local filmmaker. I was invited to see it. It's called Killing Ed. It's about charter schools, the back and forth between charter schools and public schools. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this is they use the worst case example of what can go wrong with charter schools, which is the Gulen organization, started by Fethullah Gulen. Now, Fethullah Gulen was someone who was a radical imam in Turkey. So radical, in fact, that he had to flee the country. What he was saying in Turkey was he wanted to establish a transnational Islamic state, a caliphate. Does that sound familiar? Of course, this was prior to 1999. He fled in 1999, 16 years ago, well before ISIS appeared on the scene a couple of years ago when they started calling him ISIS, because we all know what ISIS is. We have seen the American government, we've seen the CIA create the Mujahideen and use them against Russia. They became Al-Qaeda. Then Al-Qaeda goes into Syria to be used as our surrogates. They call them al-Nusra at first, then they call them ISIS. And this is something that's been going on a long time, and he had to come up with a new narrative. And we're going to tell you how this worked out when we come back. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host. We were talking in the last segment about Tony Blair apologizing that he'd received bad intelligence and saying that because somebody else had made mistakes. I mean, this is not even mistakes were made type of vague apologies. He's not even acknowledging responsibility for bad intelligence. He said, I received it. I'm sorry I received it. But hey, you know, wars happen. So after all that's happened, and after we see now that ISIS has been the logical conclusion, many people are saying, the blowback, that's what he's trying to put out there for you. What I'm trying to get you to understand is that this is not blowback. This is not only a phony apology, it is a phony explanation for ISIS. You have to understand, as we've pointed out so many times here on InfoWars, they have been using Islamic jihadists as surrogate fighters for a very long time against Russia. And of course, Vladimir Putin just said that. He said there are no moderate terrorists, in spite of the what we've been told by John McCain as he meets with al-Nusra, which then becomes al-Qaeda. They've seen the fact that we used the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Russians, then they became al-Qaeda. They've seen the fact that we used Chechen terrorists against Russia internally, then they brought these same Chechen terrorists into Syria. They became al-Nusra and ISIS. This is very obvious to everybody. We've had even congressmen, when they were trying to get the Syrian war started in a year and a half ago, congressmen were saying, and it became a meme, we helped to publicize that, do not use our military forces as an air force for al-Qaeda. Everybody knew that these quote-unquote Syrian rebels and moderate rebels, so forth, they were all al-Qaeda. They were the jihadi terrorists, whatever name you want to call them. ISIS, ISIL, it doesn't matter. They're all the same. And we knew that it was rigged up. We had multiple congressmen saying it. We had Dennis Kucinich, retired congressman, saying it. Rand Paul, I think. Ted Cruz said it. It's Air Force for al-Qaeda. And, of course, they're being used as surrogates. But this is not something that happened because of bad foreign policy. This is by design. It's by design by the CIA. The CIA created these organizations. They equipped these organizations. They trained them. And they continue to equip them and support them and not fight them. And that's what we're seeing now that Putin is going into the area. We have this article up on Infowars.com. Baghdad allows Russia to bomb ISIL terrorists who are running from Syria into Iraq. They say, come on, get rid of them. We're tired of them being given equipment and allowed to operate here with impunity because the Americans can see them there. But they want to use them as leverage against not only Russia, but against us internally. Understand that when the USSR collapsed, they lost their justification for the big ticket items that they had been using, the military-industrial complex, for the Cold War. How do you justify these transcontinental ballistic missiles, the multiple warheads, the massive bombers, and the big naval group carriers? You can't justify that against terrorists. So they had to start the Cold War back up. And what better way to do it than to use the same group of terrorists that they had used to essentially defeat the USSR in Afghanistan, the same group of terrorists that they had created in order to start the never-ending war on terror to justify the buildup, the military buildup within our country, within America, the militarization of the police, and using the military as police in our country. And a good example of this, as I started to talk about yesterday, was the I started talking about in the last break, was the film that I saw yesterday that was going through the history of one of the largest charter school groups in the country. And it's being run by a guy who is here on exile out of Turkey, Fethullah Gulen. He had to flee Turkey 16 years ago because he was trying to create ISIS 16 years ago in Turkey, a transnational Islamic caliphate. And he was thrown out of Turkey, he had to flee. Where did he go? He went to America, and he got into America because the CIA gave him special letters. There were many people in the government that didn't want him to come into the country, that opposed that. But they were overruled by these letters by the CIA. And so what has he done? In the last 16 years, he has been setting up Islamic schools for his brand of Islam throughout the world, and especially in the United States. And not only that, but we are subsidizing that. And he talks about how he's creating the golden generation, talking about how they're going to set up a spider web to collect people in this spider web. They're going to bide their time, just like a spider. They're creating this web. They're creating the next generation of fighters in these schools, and they're just going to wait for this to happen. And he's supported in all this by the CIA, the same people that created Al-Qaeda, the same people that created ISIS. The way you want to the way you can change society, the way you can control societal change, of course, is through schools, through education. And, you know, I don't want my schools being controlled by somebody like Bill Ayers, but that's where he went to hang out. See, the educational establishment, the other side of this, of course, we can have organizations like the Gulen schools get massive funding from the government through the charter school program. But on the other side, you have the socialists like Bill Ayers who insinuate themselves into the government education system with the intention of remaking our society. And that's been the purpose of the government schools for quite some time. They didn't really start to realize that purpose until they consolidated control to the national level. And now things are starting to change very rapidly. We can all see what's happening. And the question is, are we going to be able to control that? But that's the way you change society. Every dictator has known that you grab the children when they're young, going all the way back to Plato's society. He said, we got to take the children away from their parents. We don't want to have families. Not only do they not want to have strong families, in Plato's Republic, they wanted to make sure no one even knew who their mother and father were. And so that's been the goal of people who want to have an authoritarian society throughout history. And you've heard the quotes, give me a child when he's 3, let me have him for a few years and he's mine for life. Or the biblical version of it, train up a child in the way he should go and he will not depart from it when he is old. So there's your choice. You want to change the future? You do it with your children. And you either turn your children over to some social engineer, whether they're an Islamic fundamentalist or whether they're a socialist like Bill Ayers, or you do it yourself and you instill the values in them that you want to instill in them. That's the future. The future is in your hands to educate your children, but that's where the people who want to engineer, who want to overthrow society, and I think it's very troubling to see that we have all these Islamic schools done by one of the first persons to talk about the Islamic State, to talk about a transnational caliphate being brought here to the United States and being used to train children in the United States and bring over a lot of people to do that from Turkey, by the way. Now, there's another article that we have today on Infowars.com, again, about Syria. Russian airstrikes hit 9 hospitals in Syria. I've talked many, many times about the repeated airstrikes by the Obama administration in Afghanistan. They attacked a Doctors Without Borders hospital for over a half hour, a hospital that they knew was a hospital prior to that. They were called as the attack was going. That continued on for a half hour. It was a horrendous atrocity. They have not apologized for it. They tried to cover up the investigation, but now we see that it is something that is now evidently the rule of war by everyone. Now we have the Russians doing it to 9 hospitals in Syria. That is the kind of brutality we have, and it makes it all the more important that we stop these wars.
Unfortunately, you've grown up hearing voices that incessantly warn of government as nothing more than some separate, sinister entity that's at the root of all our problems.
It's time to stop submitting to this tyranny. It's time to realize that we're being enslaved.
Some of these same voices also do their best to gum up the works. They'll warn that tyranny is always lurking just around the corner.
Tyranny with a capital T.
You should reject these voices.
Everything that's been done with torture, rendition, the NDAA, the Patriot Acts 1 and 2, from day one was focused on the American people, period. That's it. It's always been about erasing the Bill of Rights and Constitution and rolling out NSA spying publicly, saying it's for Al-Qaeda, rolling out torture, saying it's for Al-Qaeda, but it's really for the general public, rolling out total control and the end of any underground free market systems in the name of fighting Al-Qaeda, but really shutting down any type of free commerce. This is all about converting us from a free society to a tyranny with a capital T. And it's that type of behavior that spurred me to do the research to develop a true nutraceutical formula that was designed to smooth out and help children focus. All of our children are hit with modern mind control. Television, music, fast food, GMOs, sugars, you name it. Young humans have not yet developed their nervous system and are being hammered daily by globalist concoctions. It's no wonder they can't focus and calm down and then are put on dangerous psychotropic drugs. Working with my team, we set out to find the best formula with the highest quality ingredients that children would actually like and take. We worked with the leading manufacturer in nutritional supplements that are safe for children to bring you the most affordable and powerful calming formula out there. Introducing Child Ease with herbs and calming extracts like chamomile and lemon balm and essential nutrients that taste great. Obtain your Child Ease today at InfoWarsLife.com. That's Child Ease exclusively at InfoWarsLife.com.